For 3 decades, Stephen Colbert built a massive wall between his public persona and his private reality. The world knows him as the sharp, quick-witted master of political satire, a man who turned irony into an art form. But behind the studio lights and the roaring laughter of live audiences lies a deeply calculated existence, forged in the ashes of an unspeakable childhood tragedy. We think we know the man who speaks to millions every night, but the facts suggest a much colder, more deliberate separation of identity. What happens when the character you play completely consumes the person you actually are? For 30 years, Colbert operated in the shadows of his own fame, hiding a complex psychological blueprint that no one saw coming. The truth isn't found in his monologues, it's hidden in the quiet, gritty reality he left backstage. Before the late-night desks, the glowing monitors, and the thunderous applause of the Emmy Awards, there was only a quiet, unassuming house in South Carolina. It was a home that would be permanently shattered by a single, catastrophic event on September 11, 1974. On that humid evening, Eastern Airlines Flight 212 crashed in a cornfield in Charlotte, North Carolina. Among the casualties were James Colbert, a respected doctor, and his 2 youngest sons, Peter and Paul. Overnight, an 11-year-old Stephen Colbert was left alone in an abruptly hollowed-out house, the sole remaining child at home with a severely grieving mother. This was not merely a tragic event, it was the precise, violent intersection where a powerful defense mechanism was engineered. To survive the suffocating weight of an all-consuming domestic grief, Colbert did not cry, nor did he break down. Instead, he detached. He retreated completely into a silent, insular world of science fiction, fantasy literature, and highly complex role-playing games. In these imaginary landscapes, control was absolute, and death could be rolled away with a pair of dice. This was not typical childhood play. It was early, rigorous psychological conditioning. He discovered a foundational truth that would govern the rest of his life: if you control the narrative, reality cannot pierce you. By the time he reached early adulthood, he had mastered the art of wearing an emotional mask so flawlessly that the people around him saw only a vibrant, charming young man. No one noticed the fractures underneath the polished surface. He learned to transform his deepest pain into a sharp, intellectual distance, ensuring that nobody could get close enough to see the ghost town he left behind in South Carolina. But how long can a human being live inside a fortress of fiction before the walls begin to collapse inward? In the gritty, competitive underbelly of the Chicago improv scene during the late 1980s and early 1990s, Colbert discovered his ultimate psychological weapon: total saturation in satire. He did not merely want to perform, he sought to engineer a vessel that could withstand the scrutiny of the public eye without revealing a single shred of his true self. When he eventually landed on Comedy Central's The Daily Show and later developed The Colbert Report, he constructed a hyper-conservative, fiercely arrogant political pundit, a terrifyingly accurate caricature of modern media ego. Colbert played this character so intensely, and with such unwavering commitment, that the lines between the performer and the performance began to bleed. He did not break character when the cameras stopped rolling. He conducted high-profile press interviews entirely as the pundit, treating his real self as an active liability that needed to be locked securely away in a vault. Publicly, he was celebrated as a fearless truth-teller who mocked the absurdities of the political elite. Privately, he was executing a rigid, grueling daily ritual designed to keep his actual personality from ever slipping into the light. For over a decade, he spent his days speaking words he fundamentally did not believe, receiving ecstatic cheers from millions of viewers who had absolutely no idea who he really was. It was a chilling masterclass in psychological duality. He had vanished completely inside his own creation, achieving massive wealth, critical acclaim, and global fame by systematically erasing his true identity from the public record. Yet, as the years pressed on, a terrifying question began to echo in the dark corners of the studio after the tape stopped rolling: if this hyper-aggressive character ever stops talking, who is actually left to speak? Living a double life is not just emotionally exhausting, it alters the fundamental chemistry of how a person interacts with reality. For over 10 years, Colbert spent far more hours per day being the loud, theatrical Colbert than he did being Stephen. He maintained a strict, almost clinical detachment the very second the studio cameras turned off. He would walk immediately off the stage, bypassing staff and writers, to retreat into the absolute silence of a private dressing room. The entertainment industry praised his profound dedication to the craft, but the cold facts revealed a man trapped in an existential prison of his own design. He was a deeply devout, traditional family man at home, yet a cynical, ruthless, and mocking satirist at work. The ongoing psychological friction required to balance these two entirely opposing forces began to take a heavy, unseen toll. Close associates and longtime friends began to notice a quiet, distant coldness behind his eyes whenever the cameras were not actively rolling. The warm, engaging colleague vanished, replaced by an intensely focused technician who treated human interaction like a series of script cues. He had successfully constructed a life where his real thoughts, his true beliefs, and his lingering grief were completely inaccessible to the public. He was entirely safe from the unpredictable cruelty of the world, but he was also entirely isolated inside his own head, trapped behind a facade that the public demanded he wear every single night. What happens to the human psyche when the mask finally refuses to come off, even when you are completely alone in the dark? In 2015, the character that had protected Stephen Colbert for a decade was forced to die. He accepted the highly coveted hosting gig at CBS's The Late Show, replacing David Letterman. This career leap came with a massive catch: he could no longer hide behind the satirical puppet of a right-wing pundit. The network, the advertisers, and the audience demanded that he sit at that historic desk as himself. This transition was not just a high-stakes career move, it was a violent, painful psychological detox. In the early months of the show, television critics and astute viewers noticed a palpable, uncomfortable tension in his delivery. Without the thick, ironic armor of his caricature, Colbert looked utterly exposed, almost defensive. The gritty truth of network late-night television is that it demands a radical, almost naked vulnerability, something Colbert had spent 30 years actively running away from. He had to painfully relearn how to speak to a crowd without an ironic shield to deflect their gaze. Every nightly monologue and every celebrity interview became a silent, agonizing battle between his deeply ingrained instinct to hide and the commercial pressure to reveal his true self. He was rich, immensely powerful, and standing at the pinnacle of American entertainment, yet he was utterly terrified of being truly seen. The world assumed he was simply finding his footing on a new network with a new format, but behind the scenes, a much darker, internal battle was being fought against his own defensive instincts. Could a man who spent his entire adult life in disguise ever truly survive the harsh, unblinking light of reality? Behind the warm, grandfatherly smile and the comforting presence displayed on network television lies a fierce, unyielding control freak. To ensure that his private life remained completely insulated from his highly publicized career, Colbert established an incredibly strict, militaristic environment backstage at the Ed Sullivan Theater. Information was heavily locked down, and access to his inner circle was made virtually impossible for outsiders. This was not standard celebrity paranoia, it was a highly calculated strategy to protect the remnants of the double life he had built over the decades. He demanded absolute, flawless perfection from his production staff, utilizing a cold, analytical detachment to manage corporate crises and creative disagreements. Those who worked closely with him reported that he rarely, if ever, let his guard down, treating the television studio less like a creative playground and more like a high-security laboratory. He kept his wife and children completely separate from the Hollywood publicity machine, drawing a hard, uncompromising line in the sand between his labor and his life. He successfully managed to prevent the tabloid media from ever digging into his real vulnerabilities or his past traumas. But when a person spends that massive amount of daily psychological energy controlling their environment, they inevitably create deep fractures in their relationships. He had insulated himself perfectly, but the pressure inside the room was rising, and rumors began to circulate about the immense emotional cost of keeping the curtain drawn so tight. No secret, no matter how carefully guarded by public relations teams and corporate contracts, stays completely buried in the hyper-connected digital age. As the years marched into the late 2010s and early 2020s, visible cracks began to form in the carefully managed separation of Colbert's two distinct worlds. The grueling schedule of producing a daily show began to wear down his defenses, and sudden, unscripted moments on live television began to leak his true emotional state to the audience. There was a sudden, unexpected tear during an interview about the nature of grief with actor Andrew Garfield. There were flashes of genuine, unedited, weary anger during breaking news segments that lacked any protective layer of comedy. The real, traumatized Stephen was violently breaking through the concrete facade he had spent decades pouring. Podcasters, media critics, and investigative journalists began piecing together the timeline of his career, realizing that the joyful, hyperverbal man they saw on television was an entirely manufactured illusion designed to deflect intimacy. The public began to question the authenticity of his entire late-night persona. Was his nightly warmth just another sophisticated layer of performance? The narrative he had spent 30 years protecting with his life was suddenly under threat, not from an outside enemy or a leaked scandal, but from his own human exhaustion. The contract he had made with his younger self to stay hidden from the world was officially unraveling on national television. The ultimate truth of Stephen Colbert's double life is not a traditional Hollywood scandal of malice, greed, or corruption. Instead, it is a quiet, profound tragedy of psychological survival. The 30-year deception was never about tricking the audience for the sake of a con. It was about protecting a deeply traumatized, 11-year-old inner self from a world that had proven itself to be fundamentally violent, unstable, and unsafe. By treating his public career as a clinical, detached performance, he successfully kept his soul intact through the meat grinder of modern celebrity. However, that safety came at an unimaginable cost: total emotional isolation from the very millions of people who loved and admired him. He achieved the highest peaks of American media influence by effectively becoming a ghost in his own life, watching his own success through the eyeholes of a beautifully crafted mask. As the final layers of his privacy are pulled back by time and age, we are left looking at a man who traded his true identity for the ultimate prize of safety and control. It begs a final, chilling question that echoes far beyond the studio walls of late-night television. When you spend your entire life perfecting a lie just to survive your own reality, does the truth even matter anymore? Or does the character win in the end?